Hello, I'm Ron Newman. Welcome to a new series, Diplomacy at Risk, that is going to focus on why Americans should care about diplomacy. I have to tell you that this is something I spent 37 years, actually 40 in the federal government, because I started off as an infantry officer in Vietnam and then went on to have a career mostly in the Middle East, a little bit in Africa, and was ambassador in Algeria and Bahrain, in Afghanistan, spent some time in Iraq. My career probably was not normal given the number of places I've been in where people either wanted to kill me or were shooting at me. So it's not necessarily what everybody thinks of in the Foreign Service, but it was a lot of fun. Welcome. This is Diplomacy at Risk. This is a series about what diplomacy is and why you as Americans ought to care about it. And we're in our first episode of this, which is basically an overview of diplomacy. My guest tonight, somebody who spent a lot of time in Latin America. Many of you, or at least a few of you, might have heard about a 30-year war in Colombia and Plan Colombia. My guest tonight, Pete Romero, Ambassador Romero, had a lot to do with starting that. He didn't start the war, he started the plan. So, as I said, my guest tonight is Ambassador Peter Romero. And Pete, why don't you tell people a little bit about your career?
I had a great career. I really decided to focus my career on Latin America, as you mentioned, the Caribbean, because I felt like these were countries that really had a major impact on Main Street USA, on Wall Street, and everywhere in between. And I wanted to be part of that and to have the best kind of cooperation that we possibly could have with our neighbors.
I want to start with one of those questions that's sort of so simple, and yet you could talk a lot longer than we're going to let you. So the question is, what is diplomacy? How do you define diplomacy for people that have never touched or felt this thing?
Well, diplomacy in its basic sense is to get someone to do what you want to do. But the way it's done is an art form, because not only do you want to get somebody to do what it is you want them to do, but you want them to feel good about it. You want them to even own it and maybe even take a bow for it while you stand in the shadows behind.
One of my favorite possessions, a little plaque somebody gave me that says, "Diplomacy is the art of telling someone to go to hell in such a way that they look forward to the trip."
Absolutely. And it's knowing who you're talking to, and then there's a certain other issue called ripeness, where things are just ripe to do at that moment. Things are coming together, and you feel like there's momentum and you can get it done.
When we're talking to Americans about this business, why should they care? I mean, they've got taxes, they've got jobs, they've got employment, they've got all the things near at home. Why care about diplomacy?
Well, they should care, largely because we're coasting on the success of diplomacy over the last 70 years, post-war period, with all the institutions that we've created. They're not perfect. They need to be tweaked. But for example, to give you one example, you have the North American Free Trade Agreement. And right now it's being threatened to be trashed, and it would be a big mistake. Millions of Americans depend on it. But let me give you an analogy. If you and I went into business together 25 years ago when NAFTA was started, more or less, and we were both making a lot of money, but I was making about 5% more than you were making after 25 years. Would you trash the business? Would you walk away? Or would you renegotiate? Because you're both doing well. That's what NAFTA is all about, and that's what we really need to be thinking about, and not just destroying and hoping that something good comes out of the destruction and the ashes.
When we go on, you and I have talked inside the Beltway. We have a lot of articles that talk about diplomacy is at risk. The sky is falling. How do you explain to people that why is diplomacy at risk, and what does that mean?
What does that mean? What that means is, one of your other guests, Ambassador Mark, said it eloquently. Diplomacy doesn't stop because the United States is disengaged. Diplomacy continues, and other people fill the vacuum of the United States withdrawal. And you can see it happening right now with elected authoritarian leaders throughout the world, particularly people like Vladimir Putin, and China with Premier Xi, or President Xi. These people are engaged in filling the void of the U.S. disengagement and pulling back. And believe me, they're not going to have your interests in mind. Your interest, my interest, any of America's interest in mind. And it's not going to look pretty.
Does seeming to be, I don't want to say unreliable, does seeming to be in flux the way we are now, you're not quite sure where we're going to go, does that give us strength for making deals with allies, with others, or not?
A certain degree of uncertainty is a good thing, but when allies don't even know where you're going to be tomorrow, it presents so much uncertainty that people just shake their heads and walk away and look for something more reliable.
No.
And I think that's essentially what you're seeing in a lot of areas of the world. We're losing influence. I have a seminar that I do at Quantico, Marine headquarters, a couple of times a year, and it's to Marine Corps colonels. And there's about anywhere between 15 and 20 of them in the room. All of them have served multiple tours in Iraq, Afghanistan, other places, Yemen. They know about foreign wars, and I asked them a very simple question. And the question is, of all of the wars that we can list, and I list all of them that we know, and ask them to contribute some, are there any of them that you can tell us right now can be solved militarily? The wars don't lend themselves to that anymore. They're political, they're hearts and minds, they're good governance, they're anti-corruption, they're all of the things that are outside of the purview and the toolbox of the military.
You better have diplomacy because you can't do it without diplomacy.
You can't do it without it.
So what can Americans do if we manage to convince them that diplomacy is at risk? What should they be doing about it?
Well, what they need to be doing about it is to write their congressmen, to talk it up in communities, to do everything that they possibly can to promote diplomacy, to promote talking. We're only 1% of the national budget. And isn't it better, besides being morally the right thing to do, to be able to talk through a lot of these issues as opposed to relying on the only tool in the toolbox, which is the hammer, and in this case, the military?
Of course, I will say absolutely because I'm a diplomat too. Pete, thank you for being with us, and thank you for some very cogent examples of what it is that diplomacy is and why people should care about it.
Thank you,
Thanks.
Rod. Pleasure.
Welcome. This is a series, American Diplomacy at Risk. Its intent is to tell you what diplomacy is and why it's important to Americans, not just to us who have done it. And in case you thought that diplomats were all one thing and military was another, my guest at the moment is Admiral Mike Smith. And Mike, perhaps before I get into questions about diplomacy, you could tell people just a little bit about your career and what you did.
Sure, I'd be happy to. I was a surface warfare officer. I drove ships for a living. I spent most of my time in the Pacific, although I did have a couple Mediterranean tours. I commanded a destroyer and eventually a squadron of destroyers. In my last command, I was a carrier strike group commander out of Bremerton, Washington. And I also had time where I was doing a lot of strategy work and working with some of the combatant commanders and with the chairman.
I know that you have now organized a group, the American College of National Security Leaders, that is working on the Hill, actually reinforcing some aspects of diplomacy. So let me ask you, how, as a military officer, did you get to this concern for diplomacy?
You know, I think that what people don't understand is how critical diplomacy and the Foreign Service is to what the military does. There's nothing that the military does overseas that diplomacy isn't the cornerstone to. From just simple things like visiting a port where we get to let our crew go out and experience a foreign country, that can't happen without the embassy. To combatant commanders who are trying to establish relationships, or maybe it's in our national interest to have a base or something like that, that can't happen without the relationships that our diplomats establish in the course of their everyday work in all of our foreign embassies.
Certainly when I was in Bahrain, we worked I worked awfully closely with the Fifth Fleet Commanding Admiral.
I would imagine so.
And you know, they're managing everything from counter-piracy missions to smuggling in the Gulf. And a lot of it requires diplomatic permissions from host countries. And maybe you could also talk about this area. You know, where are some of the specific things that you've seen ambassadors and military commanders work together on?
Yeah, I've really seen a range of them. I don't want to mention the specific countries, but you know, I remember going to one country and we really needed to use their facilities as a logistics hub to be able to supply our troops that were in Afghanistan and Iraq at the time. And we went there and the military was able to bring our skill set, you know, our vast array of individuals who had a talent that could support the host country. And because of the ambassador and because of his relationship with the president and his understanding of their needs, he was able to bring us in, provide that government what they needed, which to us was just something we did, you know, without even thinking. And in return, that government now was happy to provide us the facilities that we needed. And if it had not been for the ambassador and his team, that never would have happened.
So success requires both hands.
Absolutely, and it's the sustained relationship. You know, the military, we're there for a little while, then we're moving on. You know, we don't have the time to develop the personal relationships and the in-depth understanding that our diplomats do when they're stationed there, and we have to leverage that. And I think that that's probably that, to me, when I think what's important about diplomacy, it's that relationship that you get, or it's the absence of relationships. Look what's happening with North Korea right now. I mean, that's probably the one area that we are so close to having going to war on. And we don't even have an ambassador in South Korea. You know, I mean, that's just critical that we be able to provide that level of insight to the president that now we're missing.
And it is, I mean, that is a core piece of diplomacy. It's not just listen and report, it's tell Washington what kind of policies can work, what won't work, and how the policies you've got are working.
Absolutely.
And you, the military commander on the ground, have experienced that. People talk about it being at risk now. Do you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely, without doubt. The problem is that it's just one of those cliches. It's just so easy to say, we don't need the Department of State, but we need the Department of Defense. You know, that's just makes no sense. You have to have both, and because we're trying to minimize government and put funds someplace else, that's the first thing that's put on the table, and it's absolutely at risk, and we have to do something to bring it back to the levels that our country needs.
It is very strange that a budget that is less than 2% of the federal government, hovers right around 1%, they're cutting by 30%. I don't think you actually get much out of that. You can do a lot of damage. I don't know that you're doing much good for anybody else out of the savings. As you look at this, you know, what would you say to Americans about how do they involve themselves in this? What should they be doing?
You know, my father served in Vietnam, and when he came back and his friends came back, the American people didn't treat them right. I think we've learned from that, and the American public treats our veterans and our service members wonderfully. Well, if they think that positively about veterans and about our service members, they need to understand that the Department of State is the same thing. You can't support one without supporting the other. And you have to be just as upset at cutting the Department of State budget as you would taking away support to our veterans. And they can't put up with it. They have to call Congress, they have to make a stand, and they have to understand that those two are linked and they're brothers and sisters together in the same battle.
Boy, you're speaking something I really agree with. You know, I've spent a lot of my diplomatic, I started off, as you know, as an Army officer, but I've spent a lot of my career as a, I know, there's a little parochial jealousy there, but But I transitioned to state, so that's okay. But I spent a lot of my career in war zones and in operating with the military, passing things back and forth. And it's strange to me that something that you have expressed so well here, that the military understands so clearly about the importance for diplomacy, seems to be so hard to get our government as a whole to appreciate. But thank you for joining us this evening, and thank you for bringing that perspective to bear that I think is just, and thank you for what you're doing with the Congress as well.
Well, thanks for the opportunity to be here.
Thanks. Ed, welcome to the program. This is Ambassador Ed Marks, for those of you who are watching, an old friend of mine, and one who's had a very distinguished career. Ed, can you do the really brief outline of how you spent 30 or 40 years in the Foreign Service?
Thank you, Ron. It's a pleasure to be here. Actually, I think it's been a fairly typical career for people of my generation. I spent a lot of time in Africa at the beginning, then did some itinerant roving around back and forth to Europe and to Asia, and then ended up near the end concentrating more than anything else on counterterrorism problems. And I did that in the Department of State and a bit overseas, and then of course during some time up at the United Nations. So it was a fairly classic career, quite itinerant, the career of a professional foreigner.
Thank you very much. Now, we'll go on to this, ask you some questions here. Ed, we were talking before the show, and you were mentioning that one of the most compelling examples we've got of diplomacy working with the military about security is the ongoing repulse of the Islamic State. Why don't you pick up on that?
It's practically destroyed. It has been eliminated over a process of combat against it the last 3 years, an attack on it that was conducted by a coalition of countries. And what a coalition. The United States, our Western European friends, Turkey, Russia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Yemen. These are a bunch of people and countries that have different views on many things and are in fact competitors in almost in many areas. But on this subject, in which they all agreed, the United States led the formation by diplomatic discussion and negotiation of a coalition which has succeeded in essentially defeating the attempt to establish an Islamic State in the Middle East.
At least it's defeated the territorial aspect of it. As we go into a major problem now of it going underground, we're going to need diplomacy even more.
Agreed.
One of the things we do, civilians do, military does, military trains all the time. And you've been involved in helping them sort of enact the civilian component. Why do you do that? Why do they want it? And why aren't they getting, they're active, they're the people that are really going to do it. Why haven't they got active duty State Department people doing this?
Well, the military want what they call role players, civilian role players in their exercise, because they wish their exercises to be as factual and as accurate as possible. As they say, they train in order to be able to fight. But they realize, and they make a point, that all military activities nowadays in the modern world have a important political context. So instead of having some conscripted major to play an American ambassador or a political officer, they prefer to get someone who's actually done the job and can bring into the game that perspective, that attitude, those views.
Yeah. But when you come, you bring all those attitudes. But then you go back to your life as a retired diplomat. Wouldn't it be more useful to have an active duty state person there with no denigration of what you bring to the exercise?
Absolutely right. But state doesn't seem to be able to find sufficient officers. It doesn't have the additional staff. It doesn't even have what the military call a training float. It doesn't have extra people to use in these facilities.
And that's a really important point, and I think it's a point people don't understand. It goes to how small the State Department is. It's now just a little over 8,000 people. It's being drawn down. It went up a little bit when it didn't have enough people for Iraq and Afghanistan, and as soon as we got up, now we've decided to draw it down. So there you are. The military's training to get better, They've got retired diplomats helping them. But state's not able to train to get any better at working with the military because they can't find a body. And you've taken that subject up with state, I know.
But you run the military, it is interesting. The military keep asking for state representatives. It's the military who want it, who keep asking for it and can't get it.
So the military knows they need it. They ask for it. State would like to give it, but has no bodies. And now we're going to have fewer people with less money to do less the next time the military asks. Well, that's why we say diplomacy is at risk. Well, tonight we've had some really interesting discussions. We've touched on Latin America with Ambassador Romero. We've gotten into a little bit of Africa with Ambassador Marks. We had a bit of a, I wouldn't say it was a military perspective, but a perspective on the same issue from a military voice with Admiral Smith. And what have we learned out of this? We've learned first that everybody thinks that diplomacy goes on all the time, and you can't have no diplomacy. You can have bad diplomacy. It matters. It matters to American security. You've heard that in a number of different respects. So you've got the importance of diplomacy. You've got a key point that diplomacy goes on in the world whether we're there or not. You've got this point that if our diplomacy isn't good, the people we have to work with other people. That's not good for us. You've also gotten a basic definition of diplomacy that you had several times. And then you've got something that we're all really, really concerned about. That if you don't fund the diplomacy, if you don't have enough, diplomacy is people. If you don't fund people, right now we're going the other direction. We're cutting people. We're losing our intellectual brain power. We're cutting the top of our diplomacy. If you don't retain that level of experience, and if you don't keep the flow coming in from the bottom, then we're going to have a really poor diplomacy. And that is diplomacy at risk, but it is also the interests of the nation at risk. Thank you for being with us.